I'd like to welcome our first speaker, Professor Williamson B.C. Chang. A professor at the University of Hawaii William S. Richardson School of Law, Dr. Chang graduated from Princeton University and the University of California, Berkeley Law School. He clerked for the U.S. District Court Judge Dick Yin Wong in Honolulu and began teaching at the University of Hawaii the following year. In his earlier years, he was a special deputy attorney general representing the Chief Justice of the Hawaii Supreme Court, a special legislative assistant to the United States Senate Select Committee on Indian Affairs, and a Fulbright Senior Scholar at the University of Western Australia. More recently, Professor Chang has pursued a deep interest in Native Hawaiian sovereignty, teaching courses in water rights, the legal history of Hawaii, and in nation building. He is presently a delegate to the 2016 Native Hawaiian Constitutional Convention and is currently working on a revised history of modern Hawaii that challenges United States jurisdiction over the Hawaiian Islands. Dr. Chang's presentation is entitled A Century of Occupation, the Failure of the United States to Acquire the Hawaiian Islands. Please welcome Dr. Williamson Chang.
Aloha. Hello. Thank you, Douglas. That was an extremely flattering introduction. It was about as flattering as I was nervous waiting to speak to you. Why am I so nervous? I've given this talk before, but especially to my fellow Hawaiians, Kanaka Maoli, who are in the audience, I want to say this. This is a very important moment. What I'm going to speak to is how did Hawaii become part of the United States? I'm going to present the point of view that the United States never acquired the Hawaiian Islands. Not that it was just wrongful, not that it was just unconstitutional, but never actually acquired the Hawaiian Islands. Which means to say the Hawaiian Islands are a foreign country to the United States now. And some would go further and say that means Hawaii is being occupied by the United States now and for the last more than 100 years, at least since 1900 and at least since 1898. And I want to stop and give this moment a pause to memorialize it because Hawaii is said to have been acquired by the United States by a joint resolution of Congress. I once, in 4th grade, when we were doing the Thanksgiving thing in Hawaii, you can imagine Thanksgiving in Hawaii, beach, no snow, no turkeys. And we were putting little turkeys on, cutting up little turkeys and putting pilgrims and Indians on the board. And I said to my 4th grade teacher, "Excuse me, Mrs. Sueda, how did Hawaii become part of the United States?" She looked at me like that was the strangest thing to ask. And she said, "Oh, we were annexed by the United States." I said, "We were annexed by the United States? How?" And she said, "By a joint resolution." And she hurried away. So for most of my life, I believe that. And I think that's what's standardly taught in all the schools of Hawaii. And it wasn't until 20 years ago when I opened a book of the Congressional Record and I read the debate on the joint resolution in the Senate that I realized that it was false. Because what I saw there was senators saying, it's impossible to do that, you can't do that. You can't write a piece of paper that takes the land of another country. Now, I want to say that this is a particularly important moment because I have come all the way to Washington, D.C. In 1898, on July 6th, sitting in the chambers of the United States Senate was the Queen, Queen Liliuokalani, and her counsel, John Shaw Richardson, who is the great-grandfather of Chief Justice William S. Richardson, the first Chief Justice of Hawaiian descent after statehood, who became the namesake of the law school, who I work for as an attorney. She sat and listened to the words by which words alone would take away her nation. So I want you to know that in 1898 began one of the most astounding stories you'll ever hear, one of the most astonishing chapters of American history, that Hawaii became part of the United States by the passing of a law They went home. John Richardson was very depressed. He had spent time in jail as part of a group that sought to restore the monarchy by arms in a counter-revolution, and he ended his life very bitterly. The Queen, she came to some balance with the fact that her country was gone, and she told us to persevere. She never surrendered to the United States. A lot of people think that's true. She simply yielded her police powers, saying through President Cleveland, I yield to you the police powers of my nation because I do not want your Marines to fight my soldiers and blood be shed. This was in 1893. The overthrow in 1893, it took 5 more years for the United States to complete the annexation of Hawaii. In those 5 years, the rebels who overthrew Hawaii and expected immediate annexation by treaty were denied that and had to wait. So in 1898, in the Capitol, I think it's that way, I'm sorry, in the Capitol, she was there. And a great myth and a great lie began. And the lie was Hawaii was annexed by the United States by this joint resolution. Annexed has no meaning in law. It's not a word that's used in law. It can mean either be taken by conquest, be taken by treaty. So it's sort of useless. Annex means just to take. You cannot annex a country by passing a law. That is the point of my paper. So my paper was out there. You may have a copy of it. There were 80 copies. I don't know exactly how many people are here, but a copy of my latest work is out there, and I have a forthcoming book called A Rope of Sand, the documentary history of the United States' failure to take Hawaii by joint resolution. Some senator from South Carolina called the joint resolution a rope of sand, and I thought that was so apt a metaphor. Imagine a rope made of sand. The United States throws this lasso of sand around Hawaii and brings it in. That's all that it was. So that's the story I'm going to tell you today, and I really want you to realize that the Queen taught patience, and she taught perseverance, and she taught forgiveness. And this is the moment in Washington, D.C., where this falsehood, I believe, will begin to unravel at the proper place, a place of truth, the Smithsonian Institution, and the capital of the United States. What's going to happen next, I really won't have time to talk about. I'm going to tell you the story of the last 100 years. So some people are calling Hawaii occupied territory. And you might wonder, what does that mean, occupied territory? Hawaii's under occupation. Well, you know about the occupation of Japan by the United States. You've heard of the occupation of Iraq. Today, you can no longer conquer other countries and make them territory of your own. That's a violation of the Charter of the United Nations. As an act of war, that's a terrible thing to do. If you take a country, you can only basically sit on it as its ruling government while its government is still sovereign. You never can acquire the sovereignty of the underlying country. So when people say Hawaii is occupied, what they're saying is Hawaii is still alive. The Kingdom of Hawaii still persists. The nation state called the Kingdom of Hawaii, which was overthrown from within, they say. It wasn't really overthrown. They just sort of gave them the benefit of the doubt. And then the United States came in, and by this joint resolution, supposedly annexed Hawaii. And what Queen Liliuokalani heard was, for example, the statement is made like this by Senator Allen from Nebraska. A joint resolution, if passed, becomes a statute law. It has no other or greater force. It is the same as if it were entitled an act instead of a joint resolution. That is its legal classification. It is therefore impossible for the government of the United States to reach across its own boundaries into the dominion of another government and annex that government or person or property therein. But the United States may do so under the treaty-making power, which I shall after discuss. Allen goes on to say, Mr. President, how can a joint resolution such as this be operative? What is the legislative jurisdiction of our Congress? Does it extend over Hawaii? May we, in this anticipatory manner, reach out beyond the sea and assert our authority under a resolution of a Congress within the confines of that independent nation of Hawaii? Where is our right, our grant of power to do this? Where do we find it? Some assume to discover it in the supposition that there has been a cession, that is, a giving away by Hawaii, which in truth has never been made. Hawaii is foreign to us. At that debate, more senators were opposed to the joint resolution than for it. I noted that a treaty could have worked. Most of the United States has acquired its territories by treaty. They tried a treaty in 1897. It failed. Why? Because a treaty acquiring territory has to be ratified by the Senate, and that requires a 2/3 vote of the senators present to ratify it. In the fall of 1897 and 1898, the Senate could not muster the 2/3 it needed to ratify the Hawaii Treaty. They were opposed by the people of Hawaii. The native Hawaiians were, at that time, were called Kanaka Maoli. They were opposed by sugar interests. They were opposed by other interests as well, but they could never pass the treaty. So someone came up with a bright idea of, let's do it by a joint resolution. It's an end run. A joint resolution is just an act of Congress. It doesn't need a 2/3 supermajority. It only needs a majority. So this is that story. Number one, you must remember Hawaii was an independent sovereign nation as of 1843-44. The United States acknowledges it. It is on equal standing with the United States, and most people don't know that. If you know that, you ask the question, then how did that change? It changed not because there was a treaty. The treaty failed. It failed 3 times. There are 3 different opportunities. It not only failed, but when it came for the adoption of the laws to govern the territory of Hawaii, the United States confessed that it never acquired Hawaii. In the laws of the Organic Act, Section 2, the United States could not adopt, it could not find any way to describe what it acquired because it hadn't acquired anything. So whichever state you might be from, Montana, Colorado, Wyoming, Idaho, if you look up in a treaty by which your lands were acquired, you'll find a description of your state in metes and bounds, natural monument to this peak, to that river, this longitude, to that latitude. They couldn't do that for Hawaii because there was no treaty. So they described Hawaii by saying, Hawaii is going to be those islands acquired by the joint resolution. They knew what they were doing. You can't acquire anything by a joint resolution, so there is nothing in the territory of Hawaii in 1900. And we'll see that it was the same problem when it came to statehood. So this is a poster, Deoccupy Hawaii Now, that was held in a Department of Interior hearing in 2014. These are my friends. The Native Hawaiian movement. Sovereignty is a very important issue, and this Constitutional Convention that's meeting on Monday, begins on Monday. I'll be a representative there. We're going to discuss possibly, hopefully, independence of some sort. That's former Governor David Waihe Jr. or the third, excuse me, a native Hawaiian governor who was on the Hawaiian roll. He, myself, and in the audience is Dr. Keanu Sai. We were on a panel, 2014, April 17th, when this information was first made widely public. Now, it had been lurking around and been in the courts for a while, but it really came out in 2014. So you're one of the first to hear this. You probably never said, you said, what? You're saying to yourself, Hawaii is not part of the United States? A guy need a passport? No, don't worry. Nothing has changed for the moment. That's a picture of one of our prominent Native Hawaiian men, John Osorio. This is what's going on in Hawaii. Signs saying, they're asserting Hawaiian sovereignty. This is property of one of the groups that's claiming and announcing that it's the restored Kingdom of Hawaii. So let's do a little background history of Hawaii first so we can get things straight, and then we'll move on with this topic. So Hawaii was, as Doug was mentioning, a nation, but not a nation recognized by the community of nations, largely European, largely Christian. In 1843 and 1844, the community of nations began to recognize Hawaii as an independent sovereign state, just like the United Kingdom or the United States. France and the United Kingdom in 1843, 1844, the United States, eventually followed by all nations in the community of nations, and followed by many treaties that could only mean that Hawaii was given the same stature and equality as the nations that were signing treaties with it. This is Kamehameha III as a young boy. He was a very important king. He reigned from 1820 to 1852, I think. I'm sorry. A lot of the laws were written under him. The nation, he wrote the first constitution. He established diplomatic relations, and Hawaii really became known as a nation, as an independent sovereign nation under Kamehameha III. Okay, then the rough times began. Sugar becomes so profitable, so powerful, and largely in the hands of foreign and American businessmen or expatriate Americans who are born in Hawaii. I think Donald Trump would call them anchor babies. They go to Yale and all that, but they live in Hawaii and they take over the sugar industry, and they're not happy with the laws that cover the allocation of water, and they're not happy with the monarchy, which is a constitutional monarchy by that time. So they attempt an overthrow that the United States is clearly aware of, because there's a ship in Honolulu Harbor, the USS Boston, and 167 Marines are landed to assist and support 13 men who overthrow a country of 120,000 people. What they did was go to one of the government buildings, like one of these government offices, sit on the stairs and read a proclamation, like, we proclaim ourselves the government. And there's people eating lunch and looking at them like, oh, that's interesting. But the United States minister to Hawaii declares them to be the government of Hawaii. And he does that sort of on his own. He's rebuked. Grover Cleveland says, in fact, it was an act of war, attempts to retract it, attempts to restore the monarchy, but he can hardly do that because Congress is not with him. So this provisional government, as it's called, lasts from 1893 to 1898. And then in 1897, that treaty I talked to you about was attempted. It failed largely because of the Kue petitions of Hawaiians, 23,000 Hawaiians, who petitioned the Senate and House of the United States to reject annexation. Hawaiians were so organized. You have 40,000 signatures of 23,000 people sent to Washington, and it's presented to the Senate showing You don't have the consent of the governed. How can you, under your American principles of democracy, simply annex us by a joint resolution? Nobody signed a treaty. Okay, in 1898, and that's one thing let me step back for a moment and say, it was the United States that refused to ratify the Treaty of Annexation. Think about that. It's the United States people who were largely opposed to the taking of Hawaii. That's you. Your representatives, your ancestors thought it was wrongful, thought it was not democratic. So the United States refused annexation. Hawaii was in the hands of a puppet government. Yet the United States administration changed and McKinley, an expansionist, became president. He wanted Hawaii because he was at war with Spain. And he wanted Hawaii as a base on the way to the Philippines so that he could use it for recoaling. And so he sought the advice of John W. Foster, a former Secretary of State. And John W. Foster said, let's use a joint resolution, a piece of paper. And so the piece of paper eventually passed because the filibuster led by Allen and others failed on July 6 in the heat of summer. And you know what summer is like in Washington, D.C. without air conditioning. That was the ploy of the pro-annexationists. They wanted to sweat out the opposition, and they did. It failed on July 4th, and on July 6th, it passed. And on July 7th, President McKinley signed a piece of paper, never ratified or signed by any Hawaiian person. Even the puppet government in Hawaii never signed it. The puppet government in Hawaii was against it. It was signed by the United States, unilaterally declaring Hawaii to be part of the United States. Now, let me ask you this. If the United States, by signing a paper, can annex Hawaii on its own, can Hawaii's legislature, by signing its own law, acquire the United States? They're equal in sovereignty. Sure, it could mean that any country could annex any other country. But you can't do that. It's the first time ever anybody tried it in history. The only time anybody has ever gotten away with it. And today that stops here. Well, you're the first to hear about it. What I mean is the unwritten history, like the Trail of Tears was once a secret, is being revealed in the place where it started. So in 1898, on August 12th, a ceremony was held in which the Hawaiian flag was brought down, the United States flag was raised, and from then on, the United States claimed Hawaii as a territory. Okay, so here we have a picture on the left of one of the ringleaders of the Committee of Safety, Lauren Thurston. That's the Queen on the top. Sanford Dole, with the really long, interesting beard, was Chief Justice, a friend of the Queen, but he betrays her by becoming the president of the rebel provisional government. So Hawaii becomes a territory of the United States. It's not a happy time, particularly for Hawaiians, because they once had the power of a plurality of the electorate. Now they were a minority. They were really being occupied, and one of the prohibitions in occupation is you're not allowed to settle people from the mother country into the colony and outnumber the people in the colony and therefore control them. You also have to leave as soon as your military purposes are over, and you must allow the government and the laws of the occupied country to still prevail. Well, the problem was the United States, somebody really blew it. This is like the hugest mistake in American diplomatic history. Somebody said, go ahead and take them by a joint resolution. They did. And they didn't know the consequences. We'll see the consequences. They made it a secret. They told all the Hawaiians that they were part of the United States. They told the world that Hawaii had been annexed. And then along comes 1950s, And the Cold War after World War II breaks out, and the United Nations is created. The United Nations lists Hawaii as a non-self-governing territory, as a colony. And that's sort of bad sounding, yeah? You got a colony, that's like your imperial power. The United States people didn't like that idea. The United States administration didn't like that idea. It doesn't fit with the Constitution. It was the Soviets who went around colonizing people, extending their will and power over people, not us. So we had to do something about Hawaii. So they pushed Hawaii towards statehood. And in 1954 began serious discussions of statehood. And in 1959, Hawaii was admitted as the 50th state. Did that cure the joint resolution? No, there still was no signature, no assent, no ratification by the people of Hawaii of a treaty. The Statehood Act was simply an act of Congress. That too couldn't affect the acquisition of territory of a foreign nation. So here's a picture of Hawaii in the 50s, Honolulu in the 50s. This is the Pacific Commercial Advertiser, now the Star Advertiser, announcing on 1898 that annexation has taken place. It's a paper that the Thurston family, the ringleader, owned. And this is John Kennedy, and he was president, and I think his brother Robert was the first to realize there was something wrong in Hawaii, because he demanded that all the military bases that were surplus to military needs be returned to Hawaii. But the Kennedy administration was more concerned about the Cold War. They didn't want to be embarrassed by the fact that Hawaii was taken just as Lithuania had been taken, so they kept it a secret as well. So in the past 20 years, scholars like myself and Dr. Tsai, sitting there, have discovered documents and other evidence that clearly shows that the United States never acquired the Hawaiian Islands. These are in the Library of Congress. I've spent many, many years here. Library of Congress is there, going through the files and papers of senators who sat on the issue of statehood and suddenly realized Hawaii was not part of the United States. What are you going to do about it? How are you going to make Hawaii a state? Since 1898, the United States has claimed it acquired Hawaii, but this is an impossible claim. No nation, by an act of its legislature or parliament, can acquire the territory or dominion, that's territory, of another state unilaterally by promulgating a law or resolution. For example, there's like consent, and if I were to get married to some woman, I would have to get her consent, her knowing consent. I couldn't just write on a piece of paper, knowing that you love me, to a strange woman, I hereby accept your hand in marriage, and then we're married. That's what the United States did to Hawaii. Knowing that you want to become part of the United States, we accept. And that's exactly how the joint resolution is written. And here is what went on in the Senate floor on the date of that resolution passing. Here's Senator Allen again saying, the Constitution must begin and end with the United States. It cannot reach beyond the boundaries of our government. It would be as lifeless and impotent as a blank piece of paper in Canada or in the Hawaiian Islands, and so with a statute or a joint resolution. Most of the senators opposed the joint resolution. It was proposed by the McKinley administration, and it would pass, though, even though there was much opposition, because it was a war. It was like 9/11. You do almost anything the president wants. It's an emergency crisis. You unite, even though the Patriot Act sounds crazy. If both nations were sovereign states, and we went through this, how can one acquire the other? Sovereign means absolute power over your territory. If you have absolute power over your territory, how can somebody with absolute power over their territory only acquire your territory? If such were possible, any parliament or legislature of any sovereign state could acquire the dominion of any other independent and sovereign state. Such would bring an end to the whole meaning of sovereign. If you're a sovereign over somebody else, they're not sovereign. So it's a crazy idea, but it's amazing that for the last 100 years, the United States still insists that it acquired Hawaii by joint resolution. Senator Allen also said, the statutes are territorial in their operation. They cannot have any binding force or operation beyond the limits of the government in which they are promulgated. Okay, that changed a little. You probably know about Guantanamo Bay. In Reed Covert versus Covert, statutes of the United States can apply to American citizens abroad, but it cannot apply to territory of a foreign country. So you cannot, territory of a foreign country is absolutely within the dominion and power of that foreign country. It is only by treaty or conquest or acquisition by prescription that one sovereign nation can acquire another sovereign nation, such as the state of Hawaii, which was then governed by the Republic of Hawaii. So there was no treaty, there was no claim of conquest, and that claim of conquest wouldn't be any good anyway because the United States admits that the Hawaiian Islands are still not part of the United States. This is the beginning of the first page of the Treaty of 1897. Okay, the 1897 treaty between the United States and the Republic failed to gain ratification by the Senate. And so what we have here is three things. Hawaii was sovereign, no treaty, no joint resolution means what? No jurisdiction for the United States over Hawaii. It's not possible, it's not logical, and it didn't happen. Only 2 senators claimed that the joint resolution had any power at all to take Hawaii. One was Senator Foraker of Ohio. He said the joint resolution, even though not signed by Hawaii, didn't have to be signed by Hawaii because there was a treaty between, well, one live person, one dead person. Who was the dead person? Hawaii died at the moment the treaty was signed, so we didn't have to sign. Senator Stewart from Nevada took the opposite approach. He said, of course we can annex anything in the world. He said, if we move our boundaries down in Mexico, he sounded like Donald Trump. You move your boundaries into Mexico, we can take Mexico, they might fight for it. Somebody asked, will they fight for it? Yeah, they'll fight for it, but you gotta do it. If we pass the law, the president's gotta do it. And when asked, so can we annex anything? He said, we can annex the world. So those were the only 2 senators to support the resolution. And this is the resolution as it reads on its first 2 paragraphs, just as I described to you. It says, whereas the government of Hawaii, this is written by the United States, whereas you, my dear, having in due form signified your consent in the manner provided by your Constitution to cede absolutely all rights and sovereignty whatsoever to me, resolved, I accept. Is that a way to get married? That's not a marriage that's going to last. Okay, so people have been very troubled, scholars and the like have been troubled by the constitutionality of the annexation of Hawaii. It was strenuously contested by one of the constitutional scholars in 1929, Willoughby. Only by treaty can you acquire other territory. And all of American territory that's been acquired by the United States and added to the United States has been acquired by treaty. In actuality, the joint resolution didn't acquire Hawaii as territory of the United States because the Republic of Hawaii didn't like the joint resolution. The Republic of Hawaii continued to act as its own nation. For example, it continued to register its own ships under the Hawaiian flag. That's a sign of sovereignty. It refused to abolish contract labor, which is a form of involuntary servitude and slavery, which if United States law applied, which it should have, would be abolished. And US laws in general were not applied. So the president of the Republic of Hawaii was still called president. He had a foreign minister. Can you imagine Guam having a foreign minister? They still had foreign relations and treaties with Spain and Portugal. Can you imagine American Samoa having that? No, the Republic of Hawaii did not agree to the terms of the joint resolution itself. And finally, Article 7 of the Treaty of 1897 said it has to be ratified by the Senate. You cannot just pass a joint resolution and say that is instead of a ratification by the treaty. It has to be according to the form that both parties agreed upon, which is an official ratification by the US Senate. So in 1988, we beginning to see real cracks now in the wall. There's a legal opinion written in the Justice Department that says, we're trying to figure out how we acquired Hawaii. And they said, well, we can't figure out how we acquired Hawaii. It is unclear. This is an official legal advisor to the Justice Department saying in 1988, we can't identify the power by which we acquired Hawaii. If you have the burden of proving you own a house, you better be able to find that power. The party claiming sovereignty has the duty and the burden of showing how it acquired that property. Okay, the real problem was there is no treaty and therefore no boundaries. No boundaries for the state of Hawaii because it's like going to a store and shoplifting something and then taking it back and saying, I would like you to repair my Apple Mac. And they say, okay, we will repair it. Did you buy the service contract? Yeah. Can I see the receipt? What receipt? I don't have a receipt. How do I know you didn't steal it? Oh, you want a receipt? I'll write you one right now. And that's exactly what the United States did. Every treaty has the boundaries when it exchanges land. Even the revolutionary treaty that ended the revolution with the United Kingdom spells out the boundaries of the new states. As we expanded, all the areas that we acquired were defined by metes and bounds, natural monuments, longitude, latitude, by reference to political lines. It's very specific. Even in the days of the kingdom under Kamehameha III, he named the Hawaiian Islands by name. Oahu is part of the Kingdom of Hawaii, etc. Maui. He even said the channel waters between the islands were part of Hawaii. He was specific. The other states in the world accepted this. After the overthrow in 1893, when Hawaii changed over to a republic, even the republic wrote into its constitution a set of boundaries. But the United States had nothing because it didn't have the signature of Hawaii on any document telling them what they were receiving. It was like a purchase without a receipt. They didn't have a chain of sovereignty like a chain of title. When you buy a house, you ensure that you got it from someone who had title, and that person had title got it from someone who had title. That's the chain of title. There was no chain of sovereignty as to Hawaii because in 1898, there being no treaty or joint resolution, the chain of sovereignty was broken. So this is the most important thing to remember. In 1900, immediately after the joint resolution, the United States says, this is what we acquired, this is the dominion of Hawaii. Territory of Hawaii, that the islands acquired by the United States under the joint resolution approved on July 7th shall be Hawaii. But no joint resolution can acquire anything, so you're just saying you're acquiring nothing. Can a joint resolution acquire any islands? What's in the territory? No. Therefore, the United States, by its own admission, admits there's nothing in the territory in 1900. Okay. Now, the problem we come to is, I'm going to move ahead, statehood. Going to statehood meant bringing that definition to the United States Congress and getting it approved and put into US law. And a deception is taken place until 1959, and it's going to continue. Section 2 of the Organic Act did not describe the boundaries, nor would the Admission Act describe the boundaries. It was a great embarrassment. They bring this thing in 1954 to the Senate, and the Senate first says, what kind of definition of boundaries is this? Go bring us something very legal, very solid. They bring back a Union Oil gas map. They say, that's not what we meant. Hawaii is not part of the United States. So what to do? Some of the senators realized the real problem. It's not boundaries, it's the fact that Hawaii has never been acquired by treaty. So there's this year of cover-up. And from March 12th to March 17th, there are these secret hearings that are held in Washington. It takes a year from that time to draft 6 versions that basically say the same thing that was said in 1900. There's nothing in the state of Hawaii. So the point of what I'm saying here today is it makes sense. There is never a treaty. Why? Because America had never ratified the treaty. America turned and adopted a joint resolution, but that is only a piece of paper unilaterally prepared by the United States. What follows is admissions or confessions by the United States in the laws of the United States, including the Organic Act and the Act of Admission and the Hawaii State Constitution, that proves and shows that the United States is admitting it never acquired Hawaii. So this is the brink of what we're upon. What's going on in Hawaii, all that deoccupy, all that independent stuff is not just hot air. Hawaii doesn't want to secede. It was never part of the United States. The United States has conducted the longest running deception, unlawful breach of law, unconstitutional act, and occupation in history, more than 100 years. The people of Hawaii now are learning of it. And starting this Monday, they're going to start discussing what to do about it. One of the options is make Hawaiians a federally recognized tribe. That's why perhaps this museum is honoring and discussing sovereignty. But the United States has no more power to make Hawaiians a recognized tribe of the United States than it has the power to go into Great Britain and make Anglo-Saxons a tribe of the United States. Hawaii is a foreign country. But you cannot unravel that quickly. There are thousands of issues, 100 years of reliance. It'll take time, it'll take study, it will take collaborative agreement and governance. And it'll take humility. It'll take humility on both sides. They apologized for the overthrow in 1993, but it's not the overthrow that's the problem. It's the annexation that never occurred. So with that, I thank you. You're a wonderful audience. Just remember you were here the day in Washington that the great myth of annexation was first unraveled. Thank you.